This is the 2021 Ferrari Roma, and it's the newest model in Ferrari's lineup. It's also the cheapest model in Ferrari's lineup, the entry-level Ferrari, with a starting price of only around $222,000. It also heralds the arrival of a new generation of Ferrari interior and technology. And today, I'm going to review the Roma and show you everything. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. We've recently had some very successful sales of some exotic sports cars, including this Ferrari 458, which sold for $155,000, this BMW Z8, which sold for $185,000, and this McLaren 720S, which sold for $215,000. If you're looking to sell your exotic sports car from the modern era, sell it with Cars and Bids. You'll get the most interest and the most money for your cool car. Check out Cars and Bids at carsandbids.com. But back to the Roma with a little overview. Now, for the last decade or so, Ferrari's entry-level model has been a convertible. First it was the California, which became the California T, and now it's called the Portofino, which starts at around $250,000. Well, now that's changing. The Roma is based on the Portofino, but it's not just a coupe version. It has completely different styling and a totally new interior with Ferrari's latest technology. The Roma and the Portofino do share an engine though, a 3.9-liter turbo V8 that's also shared with the F8, but in the F8 it makes 710 horsepower. In this car, it only makes 610 horsepower. Not that 610 horsepower is anything to complain about, because the Roma is fast, seriously fast. It'll do 0 to 60 in 3.4 seconds and hit a top speed of just under 200 miles an hour. It also represents the latest expansion in Ferrari's lineup, which now includes 6 distinct models, including the soon-to-depart GTC4 Lusso. Anyway, today I'm going to review the Roma and show you all of the quirks and features of the latest Ferrari. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and see how it drives, and then, of course, I'll give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Roma with the key, which is this leather rectangle that says Roma on the bottom and looks very classy and luxurious. Previous Ferrari keys have been brightly colored, maybe a little bit more distinctive, but I guess they've ditched that, although I am hearing that there is an option in the Roma to have the reverse side of the key be a full-color Ferrari badge, although this particular Roma doesn't have that option. But you do have this leather luxury key with 2 buttons on it, not really buttons, just sort of pads on the key where you can push. Now the upper one, if you press it, it unlocks the doors. If you press it twice, it opens up the trunk, and that way you've combined 2 functions into 1 button, and so you can keep the key relatively free of multi-button clutter. But if you want, you can also avoid using the key entirely. If you walk up to the car with the key in your pocket, you walk up to the door handle, you press this little front part, and that will unlock the doors if they're locked. Or if you want to walk away, you can press that and that will lock the doors if they were unlocked, and so you can just use that on the side of the car instead of the key fob. Now as for the door handle itself, to open the doors, you just sort of stick your hand into this back part of the door handle. You can see it pushes open, and then you just pull on the door and it opens like a regular door handle situation. But anyway, next we climb into the Roma, and the first thing you notice when you get in here is that there's an image of the Roma twirling around on the gauge cluster, which is a screen. You have this blue futuristic Roma sort of twirling like it's on a twirly pedestal. And that is your first indication that this is going to be very different from other Ferrari models, because other Ferraris don't have a large gauge cluster screen like you see in this car the moment you climb inside. And indeed, this has an entirely new generation Ferrari interior with entirely new technology. It's debuting on this car, and there are a lot of quirks and features to show you. I'll start in here with another quirk you notice the moment you climb inside. that would be the engine start-stop control on the steering wheel. It is not a physical button like on basically every other car. Instead, it's part of this screen in the center of the steering wheel. You just push your thumb onto it and that starts the engine. So you don't twist the key, you don't press a button, you're pressing a screen to start the engine. Like I said, totally new interior, new technology. That is definitely a new thing. But as much as you might think an engine start-stop button integrated into a screen is an interesting idea, get ready. This car is all about screen-based controls. There are very few traditional buttons and switches anywhere in this interior. For instance, even the rear view mirrors are controlled with a screen. Over to the left of the steering wheel, you have this little capacitive touch screen. You tap on it to select the mirror, and then you can adjust the positioning of the mirror, also using the screen. Ferrari has ditched the traditional joystick mirror control, and now even changing your mirror position in a new Ferrari is done with a screen. Same deal over there with the headlights. You can see that's on a screen, and your parking sensors and parking cameras, it's all screen-based like so many controls in this car. And the screen controls continue, and they're in some unusual places. For instance, the cruise controls are on a screen mounted on one of the spokes of the steering wheel. You can see them here again, a capacitive touch screen. You press stuff and then it turns on your cruise control. Now, interestingly, these buttons only light up when they're active. So if you have the car in park, or if you have the door open, or if you just haven't touched them for a few seconds, they will darken to minimize the amount of controls that are sort of lighted and staring you right in the face. And that way your cruise controls don't have to become apparent unless you're actually tapping them and you want to use them. Otherwise, they're sort of hidden and out of place. That's one benefit of the screen, although it takes some getting used to, not having physical controls for some of this obvious stuff like your cruise controls. But the interior screen controls are far from the strangest controls in the new Ferrari Roma. That honor probably goes to the gear selector situation. Right here in the middle, it's intended to mimic the look of an old school gated manual shifter, but this car has an automatic. It's just looking like something Ferrari did in the past, bringing back some manual heritage, but this isn't a manual. Instead, the way this works is you have 3 levers and they all go up or down into the gates that are designed to resemble the look of the manual shifter. For instance, over on the left, the bottom, you can push the lever down and shift into reverse, and then you're in reverse. And one cool thing here, when you actually select reverse, you can see this little line sort of shoots down towards the R to confirm that that's what you're doing. That's a kind of a cool look, and it's the same deal with all the other stuff. In the middle, you have A and M for automatic and manual. Again, you move the lever, and you can see the little line shooting towards the A or the M. And over on the right, you have PS, which stands for power start. That's Ferrari's version of launch control, and it's the same deal. Move the lever up and you can engage power start if you meet all the conditions. So in the center, an automatic transmission mimicking a gated shifter, a retro transmission styling decision. Very strange. And there are other quirky controls in this car as well. For instance, go back to the steering wheel and you have a little red switch on here. You can use that to adjust the car's drive mode, and there are different colors around the switch that pertain to the different drive modes. For instance, if you turn it to blue, you're in wet mode. You can also go into green, which is comfort. You have sport, and you also have race, and you just adjust where that switch is positioned, and then you're in the various different drive modes. Next up, another rather quirky control in here is the one for the climate vents to move them around. It's not anything like it is in your car. You can see you have this big plastic piece in the middle of the vent. You can move it up, down, left, right. It's a strange thing for sure, but that's how you move around the climate vents in the new Ferrari Roma. Very distinctive control, just like pretty much everything else. And there are still even more quirky controls to discuss in here. I want to go back to the steering wheel, and now I want to talk about the controls behind the steering wheel, the ones you can't even see. Over on the left spoke, behind the spoke, you have a little dial that's to adjust the volume of your stereo. You can turn it up or down, and then you change the volume. Now below that, still on the steering wheel, front facing, you have some headlight controls here. Behind that, you have a hidden control, a button mounted here that allows you to flash your brights. So you can tap this little hidden button on the back of the wheel, and then you flash your brights, your high beams temporarily. Another hidden control on the steering wheel. Next up, yet another rather strange control control, again on the steering wheel, is this little dial over on the right side. This allows you to turn on the wipers. You can see right now it's in 0, which is off. If you turn it to A, that's automatic, or you can keep turning it and manually turn on the wipers. No windshield wiper stock in this car. Instead, that's mounted on the steering wheel, like so many other quirky controls. And finally, probably the quirkiest steering wheel control, that honor goes to the turn signals, which also are not controlled by a turn signal stalk like in pretty much every other car. Instead, you have little thumb buttons mounted at the top of the center part of the steering wheel. You press those and that turns on and off the turn signal. So that's how you signal while you're driving around, rather than pressing a stalk to the left side. Very unusual, although I must say you do get used to it quickly, and they're very much within reach of your thumb. And it's worth pointing out that's why Ferrari puts so much stuff on the steering wheel. They want everything to be within easy reach of the driver. So if you're in a high performance driving situation, the racetrack, you don't have to take your hand off the wheel to turn on the wipers or do anything else. It's all right in easy reach, so you can keep your hands on the wheel and keep driving safely. But probably the most important new component in this vicinity is the screen for the gauge cluster. Behind the steering wheel, you have this massive screen in here. Again, far, far better, big improvement over previous Ferrari models, which had only tiny screens that were difficult to control. Now you have a huge full screen gauge cluster like other modern cars have. And you control it on the steering wheel with this little trackpad looking thing. You can move your thumb around, you can push on it and click, or you can just move up, down, left, right. That's how you control all of those screens in the gauge cluster. So you might be wondering, what do we have in these gauge cluster screens? Well, right in the center, you can see, as always, your tachometer, a hallmark of Ferraris for a long time, the center mounted tachometer. Now to the right of that, you have sort of the main information screen, the most important thing you have up that you're currently seeing as large as possible. And over on the left, you have two sort of smaller screens that still provide information, but not a large amount of information, just sort of a cursory summary glance, if you will. Now, the cool thing is you can configure this display. So you can choose what you want to see in this gauge cluster. If you have it in this view, you can slide your thumb left or right to choose what displays in that main information screen on the right. You can have your navigation or other items, car information, whatever you want. And interestingly, when you slide your thumb to change, it makes a strange sound when it changes what it's showing you. Take a listen. But you can also completely change the display on this giant screen too. If you press the View Max button on the steering wheel, which, by the way, sounds like some sort of pay-per-view channel that you want to keep your kids from watching. But if you press View Max, then you can see it totally changes the gauge cluster screen, and now it shows a full screen view of whatever information screen you are looking at. So I have a full screen map up right now, but if I press View Max again, it changes and gives me a different full screen view, or I can press it again and go back to sort of the default view with the speedometer, tachometer in the center. So you have various different configurabilities in this gauge cluster. Again, a big technology step up over previous Ferrari models. So that's the gauge cluster screen, which is new. Next, let's move on to the center infotainment screen, which is also new and not quite as impressive as the screen in the gauge cluster. I say that for one, because it's relatively small. A lot of cars have larger center screens, but this, the newest Ferrari interior, pretty small screen, and it's not as responsive as you might think. It's pretty responsive, but some cars are just lightning quick with their responses to your touch. This one has to think for a little bit. It's not quite perfect, and frankly, consumers today demand perfect because so many gadgets, smartphones, and cars offer a more responsive experience. But the real problem with this center touchscreen is that the climate controls are integrated into this screen, meaning if you want to change the fan speed in this car, you have to tap the temperature control at the bottom of the screen, and then you have to tap the fan speed that you want to change it to. Now that's a little complicated and distracting. I'm a big fan of touchscreens. I like the fact that they integrate a lot of controls and information into one relatively small area in the interior, but I don't like when they make it more complicated to do simple, normal, ordinary tasks like just changing the fan speed. In most cars, that means just the flip of a dial. In this, a two-step process using the screen, not really that ideal. And it's the same story with heated seats. You can't just press a button to turn them on. You have to go into the screen, select the seat heating, and then turn them on. It just makes it more complicated, needlessly so. But this car is all about controls on a screen. With that said, there are a few things I like in this infotainment system. One is the ability to program a new tour. You tap this new tour icon and you're using the navigation system not to set a destination, but rather to like start a drive with your friends going through some canyons. And so it makes it easy to set waypoints or roads that you might want to hit along the way. It's like an actual tour that you'll be doing in the car, like a drive, and it makes it easier to kind of map out a drive rather than just set a destination and go the fastest way possible. One other thing I like in the infotainment system is all of the seat controls. If you want to move the seat forward or backwards or move the backrest, you of course have controls on the side of the seat, like basically every other car. But if you want to make many other movements, they're in the screen, and you can adjust all sorts of little tiny things on the seat to precisely what you want to make your drive or ride as comfortable as possible. And I like how easy that is. It's a lot easier than trying to figure out what some little button does on the side of the car. Instead, on the screen, it shows you exactly what you're adjusting and makes it easy to adjust it. And I like that. Next up, a few other interesting interior items. For one, if you want to get out, you don't have a traditional door latch to get out. Instead, there is a button to open the door. You push the button, and that's how you exit the Roma. Also worth noting, you only have one cup holder in here. It's right in the center. You put your drink down, and that's it. No two cup holders for driver and passenger. You just get one, so you'll have to decide whose drink is more important. And another interesting quirk about the Roma's interior, it has back seats. Yes, that's right. This tiny little teardrop-shaped small sports car has back seats. And as usual, as I always do, I will now climb into them, which I am seriously not looking forward to. These have to be truly some of the very smallest back seats in the entire car industry. The front seat has to travel very, very far forward to make it possible to get in. And now that it has done that, I will try to squeeze myself in. And now I'm sitting back here. I can't put my head any higher than this. I can't put my legs out. There's no way the seat will possibly retract back into place. These rear seats are seriously tiny, maybe the smallest rear seats I have ever seen in any car, but it has rear seats. So if you're looking for a practical vehicle, at least you can say that this one sort of is. But anyway, next I want to talk about the exterior of the Roma, starting with the taillights. Now, for several years, Ferraris have had sort of 4 circle taillights, 2 on each side. This has a more modern take on that. Still 2 on each side, but the circles are gone. You have a more modern sort of horizontal shape. And when you put on the turn signal, you can see another modernized element back here. The turn signals are these thin horizontal LED strips, very small and very much abandoning the old school circle look in prior Ferrari models. Now, interestingly, when you put on the brakes in the Roma, you can also see sort of a similar theme here, thin horizontal strips, although the brake lights have 2 horizontal strips, whereas the turn signal only had 1. Now, the interesting thing is what happens when you have the turn signal on, but you put the brakes on, the brake lights come on, the turn signals then switch from 1 horizontal bar to 2 horizontal bars, I guess letting you know the brakes are on, but they're still flashing. So you just have more turn signal when you put on the brakes. An odd little quirk of the Roma, but you'll notice it if you see one driving around. But anyway, more to cover back here. I want to talk about the trunk. I will open it by pressing the key fob twice in a row, and then the trunk pops open and you can open it up from there. The trunk is a little bit interesting in this car. For one thing, it's rather small, not a very large trunk for a GT car. Frankly, I would be willing to trade those useless back seats for more trunk space. I think that would make the car actually more practical, since you're never going to be really using the back seats anyway. You want a bigger trunk, but that's not what they've done here. The more interesting part of the trunk, though, is that it has no wall in the back to keep stuff from sliding out. So if you park on a steep incline or a driveway, you go to open the trunk, your stuff might just come out the back over the bumper. It seems like kind of an odd oversight. Cars have been made with trunks for years, and nobody ever really screws this up, but it's a strange thing to see here. But anyway, next up, a few other interesting quirks and features noting in the trunk. For one, on the inside of the trunk lid, you have a little plaque that lets you know what options you've chosen in this car, and you can see like your VIN, the color name, your options, all that sort of thing, which will make it easier in the future to figure out exactly how this car is specified. You also, underneath the floor of the trunk, lift that up, you have your usual Ferrari toolkit, which includes some fuses and various tools you might need to fix your Ferrari by the side of the road, which you won't be doing. You also have a Ferrari screwdriver in here, and yes, it is Ferrari branded, which makes it cooler than a normal screwdriver. And of course, the other thing you have back here is the exhaust. You have 4 big exhaust tips back here, and when you rev the engine, they sound pretty good. Take a listen. Yes, indeed, it does sound good, but it's not an old school, naturally aspirated V8. You can tell the sound is a bit off. This car has a turbo V8, 3.9 liters, but despite the lack of sound compared to older Ferrari models, it still puts up great numbers. 610 horsepower, something like 560 pound-feet of torque, 0 to 60, 3.4 seconds, and a top speed of 199 miles an hour. All very strong. And since we're talking engine, you can also see it's mounted pretty far back in this engine bay behind the front wheels to get it as close to the middle of the car as possible to minimize understeer, so you don't have a giant heavy engine hanging out over the front wheels. They do a good job of that. It's pretty set back even though the car has a long front end. And let's talk about that long front end for a second and the overall general styling of this car. Frankly, I like it. I think this is a beautiful car. Gorgeous from every angle, it looks good. Really, the back, the front, it's all very clean, flowing, teardroppy, beautiful. It looks great. I'm just not sure that it's a Ferrari. It's not the most distinctive design. It looks Aston Martin-y, maybe Jaguar F-type-y, but not necessarily distinctive Ferrari. So I would say this car has a beautiful shape, very well designed, but it's not the kind of thing when you look at it, you say Ferrari, like you do with an F8 or some of the other models. Looks good, just not as distinctive. And so those are the quirks and features of the new Ferrari Roma. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Roma, the latest Ferrari. First thing I noticed driving this car, something I've heard echoed in various different reviews of it. 2 things actually. Number 1, it's easy to drive. You sit in here, it's pretty quiet actually, you have a lot of room. This isn't like Ferraris of old that are difficult. This is intended to be sort of a more approachable, affordable GT style Ferrari, like a 911 turbo style Ferrari, and so it has to be a little bit more of a rational car, and it does feel like that. The other thing you notice is that it's comfortable, surprisingly comfortable. Even a Portofino, you get in and it has a pretty harsh ride, and you think, yeah, I could daily this, but you know, it's no Lexus or anything. This car feels more comfortable than every other Ferrari I've ever driven, to be perfectly honest. But that's not to say that it isn't fun to drive, and in fact, quite the opposite. You can feel power is tremendously available. You know, I know a lot of people don't like this powertrain because of how it sounds, but I've now driven this engine in the Portofino, the F8, and in this car, and frankly, it's great. I think it has fantastic power delivery. It feels wonderfully potent. It seems to me there are 2 ways to make a turbo engine in modern days. Car makers kind of screw it up and put too much lag, or car makers get it right and they feel just like naturally aspirated engines, but with the benefits of a turbo. And this is that. This car has the turbo engine, probably better fuel economy emissions, but it still feels, I mean, you just tap the throttle and you're gone very quick. Really, really, really a quick car. And I do want to underscore that, even though this is the entry-level GT Ferrari, it performs how I would expect from a Ferrari. It makes the right sounds, and it is just as fast as you need it to be a true Ferrari. People are going to scapegoat this car like they did the original California, but no one will if they've driven one. This thing is just fantastically fast to drive. Incredibly responsive powertrain and tremendously sharp steering. Just the moment you start to turn, boom. It's just, these cars have gotten so good that it's so interesting. Yes, an F8 is an amazing car and blah, 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 but this car is already sort of the craziest anybody could have even thought of just a few years ago. And now it's the base model that people are going to say is the cheap Ferrari. Well, If this is the base model, then sign me up. I'm into it. Now you can hear it very quiet in here because start stop, it's turned itself off at the stoplight. You can turn that off and it turns right back on. Even 600 horsepower Ferraris are not immune to fuel-saving technology. I'm starting to hear that some governments might mandate start-stop and make it non-defeatable pretty soon, meaning that all the cars will turn off at stoplights, including these. Now, speaking of stoplights, when you sit here pretty quiet, you don't hear much on the outside. I think that's one of the more impressive things. Obviously, the way it drives is impressive, but you don't hear much on the outside. Other cars, it feels luxury car quiet in here. You hear the engine, of course, like you'd want from a Ferrari, but that's about it. I don't hear cars passing, that sort of thing. The driving experience is all Ferrari. It drives like you want. It is a more restrained car, but you can make it just as exciting and crazy and mean as any other Ferrari. It feels fantastic. But I think where it falls short is, frankly, the design, which is funny because it's a beautiful design. So you have a beautiful design, a great driving experience, so how's that a problem? Well, the answer is it just doesn't look Ferrari-ish enough. And it's kind of funny because when I heard about this car, my assumption was they would make an entry-level Ferrari look very Ferrari-ish, but maybe not have the driving experience. Well, they've done the opposite. They've given you a Ferrari driving experience, but it looks like an F-Type. But you'd think people paying for the entry level would want the look more than the drive. With that said, of course, the question, would I get it? And the answer is no. Not because I don't like it, not because it's not good, but because I think I would rather have the Portofino. I don't really understand the benefit of this car. The Portofino also has a hardtop. It's a hardtop convertible, but it gives you the opportunity to put the top down. And at least here in Southern California, that's a big deal. And in a lot of the country, Texas, Florida, you want a convertible, especially if it's your fun, cool weekend car. And so that's the 2021 Ferrari Roma, the newest Ferrari model. Like all Ferraris, this is a special car, and it's expanding the ever-growing Ferrari brand to reach more buyers. This car is expensive, but the performance is great, the styling is beautiful, and the new tech is great too. And now it's time to give the Roma a Doug's score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Roma is beautiful, gorgeous, very attractive, but to me it's just a bit derivative, evocative of Aston Martin or Jaguar, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in the low 3-second range, true supercar territory, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Handling is excellent, impressively sharp, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Fun factor is excellent, the car is a thrill to drive, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Cool factor is a bit lower, as it's the latest Ferrari, but it's also the entry Ferrari, so it's not quite as exciting as something like the F8, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 40 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The Roma is surprisingly well equipped, finally, for a Ferrari. It misses a few modern touches, but it's nicely done, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Comfort is okay. The ride is a bit harsh, but it's nice enough, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is excellent. The interior is mostly very nice, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Practicality is low. Even though it has 4 seats, and 4-seat coupes usually get a 4, I'm giving it a 3 out of 10 because the back seats are so pathetically small, and the trunk isn't exactly huge. Finally, value, and it's a shockingly good one. To offer this level of performance for this money, even just a few years ago, you would have had to buy a V12 Ferrari to get this car's numbers. It's ridiculous to call such an expensive car a good value, but that's exactly what it is, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 30 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 70 out of 100, which places it here against rivals. It scores amazingly well, beating out all close rivals like the 911 Turbo, the Aston Vantage, the Mercedes-AMG GT, and Ferrari's own Portofino. I think the Roma is an excellent car, and even though it'll be scapegoated as the base model Ferrari, that's a pretty good place to be.